There are moments in the long chronicle of humanity when the very fabric of existence seems to tear, when the familiar patterns of life are irrevocably altered, and when the future, once a clear horizon, dissolves into an unimaginable haze. Such a moment arrived in the summer of 1914, a time that would forever carve a deep and indelible fissure across the 20th century and echo through all the generations that followed. This was not merely another conflict in the long succession of human struggles. It was an event of such unprecedented scale and profound consequence that its shadow still stretches across our modern world, defining nations, shaping ideologies, and resonating within the collective memory of mankind. Before this cataclysm, the world, particularly the continent of Europe, had cultivated an intricate and delicate balance, a grand tapestry woven with threads of fervent nationalism, ambitious imperial expansion, accelerating industrial might, and a complex web of diplomatic allegiances. For many, the early years of the 20th century were characterized by a pervasive sense of progress, an era of remarkable scientific discovery, technological innovation, and artistic flourishing. The internal combustion engine was transforming travel, electricity was illuminating cities, and communication was shrinking distances. There was a prevailing belief, a quiet confidence, that humanity was steadily ascending towards an enlightened future, where reason and diplomacy would ultimately prevail over the crude instruments of war. The great powers of Europe, though possessing formidable armies and navies, had not engaged in a widespread, continent-spanning conflict for decades, fostering a deceptive sense of security, an illusion of stability that masked the powerful, subterranean currents of tension building beneath the surface. Yet beneath this veneer of advancement and apparent peace, powerful forces were at work, slowly but inexorably eroding the foundations of that delicate balance. The scramble for colonies across Africa and Asia had fueled intense rivalries among the European empires, each seeking to expand its influence, secure resources, and bolster its prestige on the global stage. These colonial ambitions often brought nations into direct competition, creating flashpoints of diplomatic friction that, while often resolved through negotiation, left lingering resentments and hardened nationalistic sentiments. The very act of carving up distant lands fostered a sense of entitlement and an aggressive competitive spirit among the powers, each convinced of its own inherent superiority and destiny. Concurrently, a pervasive and often zealous nationalism was sweeping across the continent. Peoples united by language, culture, and shared history increasingly demanded self-determination, often at the expense of multi-ethnic empires that had long held sway. This was particularly potent in the Balkans, a region often referred to as the powder keg of Europe, where the decline of the Ottoman Empire and the ambitions of the Austro-Hungarian Empire clashed with the burgeoning national aspirations of Serbs, Bulgarians, Greeks, and other ethnic groups. The desire for national unity and independence, while understandable, frequently manifested in aggressive territorial claims and deep-seated animosities towards neighboring populations or ruling powers, creating a volatile environment where small sparks could ignite widespread conflagrations. The Industrial Revolution, a triumph of human ingenuity and productive capacity, also contributed significantly to the escalating tensions. Factories that once produced textiles and machinery could now churn out immense quantities of weaponry, advanced artillery, rapid-firing machine guns, and powerful dreadnought battleships. This unprecedented capacity for destruction fueled an intense arms race, particularly between Germany and Great Britain in naval power, and between Germany and France in land forces. Each nation felt compelled to match, if not exceed, the military might of its rivals, believing that a strong army or navy was the ultimate guarantor of national security and diplomatic leverage. The logic was simple yet profoundly flawed. If one nation built more weapons, its rivals would do the same, leading to an ever-escalating spiral of military expenditure and a pervasive sense of impending doom. The very instruments designed to preserve peace by deterring aggression paradoxically made war more likely, more devastating, and more difficult to contain once it began. Adding another layer of complexity to this already volatile situation was the intricate and rigid system of interlocking alliances that had developed over decades. These agreements, ostensibly designed to maintain a balance of power and prevent any single nation from dominating the continent, inadvertently created a chain reaction mechanism. If one nation were attacked, its allies were bound by treaty to come to its defense, thereby drawing other nations into the conflict. Europe found itself divided into two primary camps: the Triple Entente, comprising France, Russia, and Great Britain, and the Triple Alliance, consisting of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, though Italy's commitment would prove flexible. These alliances, intended as deterrents, instead transformed local disputes into continent-wide threats. The security of one became inextricably linked to the security of all, meaning that a localized incident, a spark in a distant corner, could quickly engulf the entire continent in a conflagration of unforeseen magnitude. In the summer of 1914, the world stood poised on a precipice, unaware of the abyss that lay just beyond. The prevailing optimism, the belief in progress, the intricate diplomatic dances, the grand imperial ambitions, the fervent nationalisms, and the colossal military arsenals had all converged to create a situation of extreme fragility. The leaders of the great powers, steeped in the traditions of 19th-century diplomacy and often blinded by their own national interests and miscalculations, failed to fully grasp the profound consequences of their decisions. There was a widespread underestimation of the destructive power of modern warfare, a naive belief that any conflict would be short, decisive, and ultimately manageable. The lessons of previous, smaller wars were applied to a world fundamentally changed by industrialization and global interconnectedness. What began as a regional crisis in the Balkans, ignited by a single assassination, would rapidly unravel into a global conflict that defied all expectations. The war that unfolded would be unlike any seen before, a horrifying testament to the destructive potential of modern technology combined with deeply entrenched human animosities. It would be fought not just on battlefields but in the skies above, beneath the seas, and across distant colonial territories, truly making it a world war. It would introduce new forms of warfare, from the grim realities of trench combat to the terrifying specter of chemical weapons, irrevocably altering the nature of conflict itself. This conflict would demand a price in human life that was almost incomprehensible, shattering entire generations, leaving behind a legacy of physical and psychological scars that would persist for decades. It would dismantle empires, redraw maps, and fundamentally reshape the political, social, and economic landscape of the entire planet. The very ideals of progress and civilization, once so confidently proclaimed, would be severely tested, leaving a profound sense of disillusionment and a deep questioning of humanity's path forward. The world that emerged from the crucible of this war would be a different world, one forever marked by the experiences of those 4 agonizing years. To understand the 20th century, to comprehend the forces that shaped our present, one must first understand this pivotal turning point, this moment when the world changed forever. It is to this complex and somber narrative that we now turn our attention, examining the precise sequence of events, the decisions, and the circumstances that led to the unleashing of this unprecedented global catastrophe. The path to the catastrophic global conflict that erupted in 1914 was not straightforward, nor determined by a single event. Instead, it was the culmination of decades of evolving political dynamics, entrenched ideologies, and complex interdependencies that slowly, almost imperceptibly, tightened around the continent of Europe. To comprehend the immense tragedy that unfolded, one must first understand the intricate and often contradictory forces that characterized the pre-war era. Forces that together created an environment of profound instability, a delicate balance perpetually on the verge of collapse. It was a period marked by an accelerating arms race, a fervent embrace of nationalistic ideals, intense imperial rivalries, and a rigid system of defensive alliances, all woven into a dense tapestry of economic competition and social tension. Each thread contributed to the overall pattern of impending doom, making the eventual outbreak of hostilities appear, in retrospect, almost inevitable. At the heart of this volatile landscape lay a meticulously constructed, yet ultimately fragile web of alliances. These treaties, initially conceived as instruments of peace and stability by statesmen like Otto von Bismarck in the late 19th century, gradually transformed into mechanisms that amplified rather than contained regional disputes. Bismarck's primary objective following German unification was to isolate France, preventing any attempt at revenge for the Franco-Prussian War, and to maintain the delicate balance of power in Central Europe. To this end, he forged the dual alliance with Austria-Hungary in 1879, a defensive pact against Russia. This was soon expanded into the Triple Alliance in 1882, when Italy joined, motivated by its own colonial ambitions and dissatisfaction with France. This formidable bloc, comprising the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Kingdom of Italy, stood as a powerful force, ostensibly designed to deter aggression. However, the very existence of such a powerful bloc inevitably provoked a counter-response. As German power grew and its foreign policy became more assertive, other nations began to perceive it as a potential threat. France, still smarting from its defeat and the loss of Alsace-Lorraine, sought allies to break its diplomatic isolation. Russia, feeling increasingly alienated from Germany and wary of Austria-Hungary's expansionist ambitions in the Balkans, found common ground with France. The Franco-Russian alliance, forged in the early 1890s, was a direct counterweight to the Triple Alliance, creating a bipolar system of power that effectively divided Europe into two armed camps. This alliance stipulated mutual military assistance if either nation was attacked by Germany or its allies, thus ensuring that a conflict involving one would likely involve the other. The final piece of this complex puzzle was the gradual rapprochement between Great Britain and its former rivals, France and Russia. For centuries, Britain had pursued a policy of splendid isolation, largely detached from continental entanglements, focusing instead on its vast global empire and naval supremacy. However, several factors began to shift this stance. German colonial ambitions, particularly its desire for a place in the sun, increasingly clashed with British imperial interests. More significantly, the German decision to embark on a massive naval expansion program under Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, aiming to build a fleet capable of challenging the Royal Navy, was perceived in London as a direct existential threat. This naval arms race, a costly and destabilizing competition for maritime dominance, pushed Britain closer to its traditional adversaries. The Entente cordiale signed with France in 1904 resolved long-standing colonial disputes and established a framework for cooperation. This was followed by the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907, which settled their imperial rivalries in Persia, Afghanistan, and Tibet. These agreements, though not formal military alliances, nevertheless formed the Triple Entente, a powerful diplomatic understanding that effectively completed the encirclement of Germany and Austria-Hungary. The consequence of this rigid alliance system was profound. It meant that a localized conflict, perhaps in the volatile Balkan region, could no longer remain localized. Each major power was bound by treaty obligations or strong diplomatic understandings to come to the aid of an ally. The system created a chain reaction mechanism, transforming what might have been a bilateral dispute into a continent-wide, even global, conflagration. It fostered a sense of collective security, yet simultaneously instilled a deep-seated fear that any aggressive move by one bloc would inevitably provoke a response from the other, thus locking nations into a dangerous cycle of mutual suspicion and preemptive action. Beyond the intricate dance of diplomatic treaties, a powerful undercurrent of imperial rivalry fueled much of the tension in pre-war Europe. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were the zenith of European imperialism, a period often referred to as the scramble for Africa and Asia. Driven by a potent mix of economic ambition, strategic considerations, and national prestige, the great powers vied fiercely for control over overseas territories, raw materials, and new markets. Colonies were seen not just as sources of wealth but also as symbols of national strength and international standing. Britain, with its vast empire, was the dominant global power, a position that Germany, a relative newcomer to the imperial game, increasingly sought to challenge. Germany's desire for a place in the sun, a phrase coined by its leaders to articulate their ambition for greater global influence, brought it into direct conflict with the established colonial powers. Incidents such as the two Moroccan crises of 1905 and 1911, where Germany challenged French influence in Morocco, served as potent demonstrations of this rivalry. These crises, though resolved diplomatically, pushed France and Britain closer together and heightened international tensions, revealing the precariousness of peace when imperial interests clashed. Similar rivalries played out in other parts of the world, from the Middle East to China, creating numerous flashpoints where the interests of the great powers intersected and often collided. The competition for resources, for strategic ports, and for spheres of influence was relentless, contributing to an atmosphere of suspicion and resentment among the leading nations. This imperial competition was inextricably linked to a rampant militarism that permeated European society. The belief that military strength was the ultimate guarantor of national security and international prestige became deeply entrenched. Consequently, there was an unprecedented arms race across the continent. Military budgets swelled, conscription became widespread, and armies grew to unprecedented sizes. Naval power, in particular, became a crucial arena for competition, epitomized by the Anglo-German naval race. Germany's construction of a modern high-seas fleet, equipped with dreadnought-class battleships, was a direct challenge to Britain's long-held naval supremacy, forcing London to commit vast resources to maintain its lead. This spiraling expenditure on armaments created a self-reinforcing cycle. One nation's military buildup was perceived as a threat by another, prompting a reciprocal increase in military spending and further escalating tensions. Moreover, militarism was not merely about the size of armies or navies. It was also about the pervasive influence of military thinking within political decision-making. General staffs across Europe developed elaborate and rigid war plans, often years in the making, designed to achieve decisive victory in the event of conflict. Germany's Schlieffen Plan, for instance, envisioned a swift knockout blow against France through neutral Belgium before turning to face Russia. France's plan, XVI, emphasized an immediate offensive into Alsace-Lorraine. Russia's mobilization plans were complex and difficult to reverse once set in motion. The inherent rigidity of these plans meant that once the wheels of mobilization began to turn, it became exceedingly difficult for political leaders to halt the process without risking strategic disadvantage. This created a dangerous cult of the offensive, where military leaders often believed that striking first offered the best chance of success, thereby narrowing the window for diplomatic resolution during a crisis. The detailed timetables and complex logistics of these plans effectively reduced the flexibility of political leaders, pushing them towards military rather than diplomatic solutions. Intense nationalism further exacerbated these tensions, acting as a powerful ideological fuel for both imperial ambition and military expansion. Across Europe, a fervent sense of national pride, often bordering on chauvinism, swept through populations. This "my nation, right or wrong" mentality fostered deep suspicions of foreigners and a glorification of one's own cultural and ethnic identity. In France, the desire to reclaim Alsace-Lorraine, lost to Germany in 1871, remained a powerful nationalist grievance. In Germany, pan-Germanism promoted the idea of uniting all German-speaking peoples under a single powerful state, fueling expansionist tendencies. Similarly, pan-Slavism in Russia advocated for the protection and leadership of all Slavic peoples, particularly those in the Balkans, which brought it into direct conflict with Austria-Hungary. The Balkan region, often referred to as the powder keg of Europe, was a particularly volatile crucible of competing nationalisms. As the Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe, continued its slow decline, newly independent Balkan states like Serbia, Bulgaria, and Greece emerged, each with their own territorial ambitions and ethnic claims. Serbia, in particular, harbored a strong desire to unite all South Slavs, including those living under Austro-Hungarian rule, creating a Greater Serbia. This directly threatened the integrity of the multi-ethnic Austro-Hungarian Empire, which viewed Serbian nationalism as an existential threat to its diverse domains. The annexation of Bosnia-Herzegovina by Austria-Hungary in 1908, a territory with a significant Serb population, ignited a major international crisis and further inflamed Serbian nationalist sentiment, drawing Russia, as the self-proclaimed protector of the Slavs, into the dispute. The subsequent Balkan Wars of 1912–1913 further destabilized the region, creating a climate of violence, shifting borders, and unresolved grievances that left the great powers deeply entangled in the region's complex ethnic and political struggles. Finally, underlying all these factors was a fierce economic competition that intensified the rivalries between the great powers. The Industrial Revolution had transformed Europe, creating unprecedented wealth and productive capacity, but also fostering intense competition for markets, raw materials, and investment opportunities. Germany, having industrialized rapidly in the late 19th century, was challenging Britain's long-held economic supremacy. Its burgeoning industries sought new outlets for manufactured goods and secure access to raw materials, often leading it into direct economic competition with Britain and France in various parts of the world. This economic rivalry was not merely about trade balances. It was deeply intertwined with imperial expansion, as colonies provided captive markets and guaranteed sources of resources. It also fueled the naval arms race, as a powerful merchant marine required a powerful navy to protect it. Tariffs and protectionist policies further exacerbated these economic tensions, creating an environment where nations viewed each other as economic competitors as much as political rivals, deepening the sense of mistrust and reinforcing the belief that national prosperity was often achieved at the expense of another. Taken together, these interconnected factors created an environment of profound and systemic instability across Europe. The rigid alliance system meant that diplomatic flexibility was severely limited, transforming localized disputes into potential continental crises. Imperial rivalries constantly generated flashpoints, particularly in contested regions. Rampant militarism, fueled by an arms race and the influence of general staffs, predisposed leaders to consider military options, while inflexible war plans narrowed the path to peaceful resolution. Intense nationalism, both within and between nations, created irredentist claims and ethnic tensions, particularly in the volatile Balkans, threatening the very fabric of multi-ethnic empires. And underlying all of this, economic competition added another layer of friction, making cooperation more difficult and rivalry more intense. Europe by 1914 was not simply experiencing a series of isolated disputes. It was a continent under immense pressure, a tightly coiled spring awaiting release. The cumulative effect of these decades of tension, suspicion, and preparation for war had created a situation where peace was not merely fragile, but precarious in the extreme. The mechanisms for preventing a large-scale conflict, such as effective international mediation or a genuine commitment to collective security beyond the narrow confines of alliances, were either insufficient or entirely absent. Instead, the continent had developed a dangerous reliance on the balance of power, a balance that was constantly shifting and perpetually threatened by the very forces designed to maintain it. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and the script, though unwritten, seemed to be moving inexorably towards a tragic climax. The question was no longer if a major European war would erupt, but when and where the spark would finally be struck. The finely tuned, yet inherently unstable mechanisms of European peace, meticulously constructed and precariously balanced over decades, were poised for an ultimate test. The continent, having long braced itself for a potential conflagration, now merely required a single, decisive spark to ignite the accumulated tinder of rivalries, ambitions, and fears. That spark would be struck in a place many Europeans might have struggled to locate on a map, during a seemingly routine official visit on a pleasant summer day. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir presumptive to the Austro-Hungarian throne, arrived in Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia-Herzegovina. This territory, annexed by Austria-Hungary in 1908, remained a contentious point, particularly for the neighboring Kingdom of Serbia, which harbored ambitions of uniting all South Slavs under its banner. The date itself was charged with symbolic meaning for Serbs, commemorating the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, a pivotal moment in their national mythology. Despite warnings of potential unrest, the Archduke, accompanied by his wife, Sophie, Duchess of Hohenberg, proceeded with the scheduled inspection of military maneuvers and a visit to the city. Their presence in Sarajevo, on such a significant date, was perceived by many Serb nationalists as a deliberate provocation, a flaunting of Austro-Hungarian authority over lands they believed rightfully belonged to a greater Serbia. Among those who viewed the Archduke's visit with particular animosity were a group of young Bosnian Serb revolutionaries, loosely affiliated with the secret society known as the Black Hand, a nationalist organization with strong ties to elements within the Serbian military intelligence. Their objective was clear: to assassinate the Archduke, thereby striking a blow against Austro-Hungarian rule and furthering the cause of South Slav unity. The plotters, 7 in total, strategically positioned themselves along the motorcade route. The first attempt occurred shortly after the procession began. A hand grenade, thrown by one of the conspirators, Nedeljko Chabranovic, bounced off the Archduke's car and exploded beneath the following vehicle, injuring several officers and bystanders. In the immediate aftermath, the motorcade accelerated, rushing to the safety of the Konak, the governor's residence. Despite the clear and present danger and against the urgent advice of his security detail, Franz Ferdinand, displaying a mix of stubbornness and a sense of duty, insisted on continuing with the day's schedule, albeit with a slight alteration. After a brief reception at the Konak, he decided to visit the injured officers in the hospital. This decision, intended as a gesture of concern, would prove catastrophically fateful. The ultimatum was a diplomatic bombshell. Europe held its breath. Serbia, a small nation facing the might of a great power, sought assistance from its protector, Russia. Russia, in turn, advised Serbia to offer as conciliatory a reply as possible, but also began to take preliminary steps towards mobilization, signaling its intent to support Serbia if war broke out. On July the 25th, Serbia delivered its response. It accepted most, but not all, of the ultimatum's demands. Crucially, it rejected the demand for Austro-Hungarian officials to participate in its internal judicial proceedings, viewing it as an unacceptable infringement on its sovereignty. While Serbia's reply was seen by many international observers, including some within Germany, as a significant concession, Austria-Hungary immediately declared it unsatisfactory. The very next day, July the 26th, Austria-Hungary ordered a partial mobilization against Serbia. The diplomatic tightrope had been walked, and now it was beginning to fray. 2 days later, on July the 28th, 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Artillery bombardments of Belgrade, the Serbian capital, commenced almost immediately. A regional conflict had officially begun. The declaration of war on Serbia triggered a rapid and terrifying chain reaction, dictated by the intricate web of alliances that had characterized European diplomacy for decades. Russia, seeing its Slavic ally attacked and its own prestige threatened, could not stand idly by. On July the 29th, Russia ordered partial mobilization, primarily against Austria-Hungary. The following day, July the 30th, under pressure from its military high command, Tsar Nicholas II reluctantly ordered full mobilization of the Russian army. This was a critical escalation. For Russia, full mobilization was a complex logistical undertaking that, once initiated, could not easily be reversed without immense chaos and a significant strategic disadvantage. Germany viewed Russian full mobilization as an act of war, not only against Austria-Hungary but also against itself, a direct threat to its eastern frontier. Germany had its own detailed war plans, most notably the Schlieffen Plan, which dictated a swift, decisive strike against France in the west before turning its full attention to the slower mobilizing Russian forces in the east. The timing was everything. If Russia mobilized first, Germany feared it would be caught in a two-front war with both France and Russia fully prepared. On July the 31st, Germany sent an ultimatum to Russia, demanding that it cease its mobilization within 12 hours. Simultaneously, Germany sent an ultimatum to France, asking for a declaration of neutrality in the event of a Russo-German war. France, bound by its alliance with Russia, refused to commit to neutrality and began its own preliminary mobilization measures. As the ultimatums expired without the desired responses, the dominoes began to fall with terrifying speed. On August 1, 1914, Germany declared war on Russia. The next day, August 2, Germany demanded free passage for its troops through neutral Belgium, a crucial component of the Schlieffen Plan to bypass heavily fortified French defenses along their common border. Belgium, despite facing overwhelming odds, courageously refused. On August 3, Germany declared war on France, citing alleged French incursions and bombing raids, though these claims were largely unsubstantiated. German troops then crossed the border into Belgium, initiating the invasion. The invasion of neutral Belgium proved to be the final catalyst for Britain's entry into the war. While Britain had initially sought to mediate the crisis, its foreign policy had long been predicated on maintaining the balance of power in Europe and preventing any single continental power from achieving hegemony. Furthermore, Britain had treaty obligations to defend Belgian neutrality, a commitment dating back to 1839. The violation of Belgium's sovereignty, combined with the growing threat of German dominance across the Channel, left Britain with little choice. On August 4, 1914, Britain delivered an ultimatum to Germany, demanding the withdrawal of German troops from Belgium. When the ultimatum expired at midnight, Britain declared war on Germany. Within a matter of weeks, a localized political assassination in a distant corner of the Austro-Hungarian Empire had metastasized into a continent-wide conflict, drawing in the major powers of Europe. The diplomatic failures were profound. A lack of effective communication, a rigid adherence to pre-existing alliance structures, the overwhelming influence of military timetables and the cult of the offensive, and a collective inability or unwillingness of leaders to step back from the brink once the momentum of mobilization had begun. Each nation, driven by a complex mix of national interest, alliance obligations, fear, and a perceived need to act decisively, contributed to the catastrophic escalation. The careful balance of power that had been intended to preserve peace had, in a cruel twist of fate, become the very mechanism that ensured a regional dispute would engulf an entire continent. The stage for a devastating global conflict was now fully set, and the world was about to witness a scale of destruction previously unimaginable. With the diplomatic avenues exhausted and the declarations of war exchanged, the intricate machinery of pre-war military planning was now irrevocably set into motion, commencing with the German Empire's long-anticipated advance into neutral Belgium. This audacious maneuver, the critical opening gambit of what was known as the Schlieffen Plan, was predicated upon the swift outflanking of French defenses by a powerful right wing, sweeping through Belgium and northern France, aiming to encircle Paris and crush the French army in a matter of weeks. The strategic imperative was clear. A rapid victory in the west would then allow German forces to be redeployed eastward to confront the slower mobilizing Russian Empire. Time was of the essence, and the plan demanded a relentless, overwhelming offensive. On August 4, 1914, German troops crossed the Belgian frontier, violating a neutrality that had been internationally guaranteed since 1839. This act of aggression immediately drew Great Britain into the conflict, as Britain had pledged to uphold Belgian sovereignty. The German High Command, under the leadership of Helmuth von Moltke the Younger, had calculated that Belgium, a small nation, would offer little more than token resistance, allowing their massive armies to pass through unhindered. This calculation, however, proved to be a profound misjudgment. The Belgian army, though vastly outnumbered and outgunned, chose to resist with a tenacity that surprised the German invaders and, crucially, disrupted their meticulously crafted timetable. The initial obstacle was the city of Liege, a strategically vital fortress city guarding the Meuse River crossings. Its ring of 12 modern concrete and steel forts, designed by the brilliant engineer Henry Alexis Brialmont, presented a formidable challenge. The Germans, expecting a swift capitulation, launched an immediate assault, but the Belgian defenders, under the resolute command of General Gerard Leman, held firm. For nearly 2 weeks, from August 5th to August 16th, the forts of Liege endured a relentless bombardment. It was here that the Germans first unleashed their colossal Krupp 420 Big Bertha howitzers and Austrian Skoda 305 mortars, weapons of unprecedented destructive power, capable of reducing the supposedly impregnable concrete and steel to rubble. The psychological impact of these super-heavy artillery pieces was immense, their shells arriving with a terrifying shriek before detonating with earth-shattering force. Though the forts eventually fell, one by one, the delay they imposed on the German advance was significant. It provided invaluable time for the French and British armies to mobilize and deploy, and it solidified international condemnation of Germany's actions. As the German right wing pushed deeper into Belgium, their advance was marked by a campaign of terror intended to intimidate the civilian population and prevent guerrilla resistance. Villages were burned, civilians were executed, and cultural heritage sites, most notably the ancient University Library of Leuven, were destroyed. These atrocities, widely reported and often exaggerated by Allied propaganda, further fueled anti-German sentiment and hardened the resolve of the Entente powers. The Belgian resistance, though ultimately unable to halt the German juggernaut, had nevertheless bought precious days that the Schlieffen Plan could ill afford to lose. Following the fall of Liege, the German armies continued their sweep, encountering further resistance at Namur, another fortified city. While Namur also eventually succumbed to the overwhelming German artillery, the combined delays at Liege and Namur, coupled with the need to divert troops to contain Belgian resistance and to confront the surprisingly swift Russian mobilization on the Eastern Front, forced Moltke to make critical alterations to the original Schlieffen Plan. The powerful right wing, intended to be the hammer blow, was subtly but significantly weakened as divisions were siphoned off. By mid-August, German forces had crossed into France, engaging the French armies in a series of engagements known collectively as the Battle of the Frontiers. These battles, including those at Mulhouse, Lorraine, the Ardennes, Charleroi, and Mons, were characterized by head-on collisions of massive armies. The French, adhering to their own doctrine of the offensive, often launched frontal assaults in their distinctive red trousers and blue coats, making them conspicuous targets for German machine guns and artillery. The results were catastrophic for the French, who suffered immense casualties in these early weeks of the war. At Charleroi, the French Fifth Army was defeated, and at Mons, the small but highly professional British Expeditionary Force, or BEF, engaged the much larger German First Army. The British, with their superior rifle marksmanship, inflicted heavy casualties, but they too were eventually forced to retreat in the face of overwhelming numbers. Allied armies, French and British, now embarked upon a desperate fighting retreat, falling back towards Paris. This period, often referred to as the Great Retreat, was a grueling ordeal. Soldiers marched for days under relentless pressure, constantly fighting rearguard actions, exhausted and demoralized, yet maintaining a fragile cohesion. The German armies, though victorious in these initial encounters, were also stretched thin, their supply lines lengthening, their soldiers fatigued by the incessant marching and fighting. The initial momentum of the offensive, while still formidable, was beginning to wane. As the German First Army, under General Alexander von Kluck, swung southwest, it found itself ahead of schedule and, in a crucial deviation from the original Schlieffen Plan, began to curve east of Paris rather than sweeping to the west of the city. This modification was made partly to maintain contact with the German Second Army to its left and partly to pursue the retreating French Fifth Army, which Kluck believed to be on the verge of collapse. However, this maneuver exposed Kluck's right flank to the west, a vulnerability that was quickly detected by Allied aerial reconnaissance, and more significantly, by the commander of the newly formed French Sixth Army, General Michel-Joseph Monnery, who was tasked with defending Paris. The critical moment arrived in early September. The German First Army, having pressed deep into France, was now within striking distance of Paris. The French government had already evacuated to Bordeaux, and the fall of the capital seemed imminent. However, the French commander-in-chief, General Joseph Joffre, remained resolute. He ordered his armies to halt their retreat and launch a decisive counteroffensive. This dramatic turning point in the opening phase of the war would become known as the Battle of the Marne. On September 6, 1914, the French Sixth Army, supported by elements of the British Expeditionary Force, launched an attack on the exposed flank of the German First Army, which was now moving east of Paris. Kluck, realizing the danger, was forced to wheel his army to the west to meet this unexpected threat, creating a significant gap, approximately 30 miles wide, between his First Army and the German Second Army to his east. This gap, a crucial vulnerability, was quickly exploited by the French Fifth Army and the British Expeditionary Force, which advanced directly into it. The Battle of the Marne was a sprawling, chaotic engagement fought over hundreds of square miles. It involved millions of soldiers from both sides, clashing in desperate, often uncoordinated battles. A famous, though somewhat exaggerated, episode of the battle involved the requisitioning of Parisian taxicabs to rush thousands of French reserve troops to the front lines, a vivid symbol of the desperate and improvised nature of the defense. While the number of troops transported by taxi was relatively small in the context of the massive armies involved, the image of civilian vehicles ferrying soldiers to battle captured the imagination and underscored the urgency of the moment. For several days, the battle raged, characterized by intense fighting and immense casualties. The German High Command, now isolated from its forward armies due to the collapse of communications and the rapid pace of events, struggled to maintain control. Moltke, receiving increasingly pessimistic reports from the front, suffered a nervous breakdown. On September 9th, recognizing the perilous situation of his armies, particularly the exposed gap and the threat of encirclement, he authorized a general retreat. The German armies, having come so close to Paris, began to fall back to a more defensible line along the river Aisne. The Battle of the Marne was a pivotal moment in the Great War. It represented the decisive failure of the Schlieffen Plan, and with it, Germany's hopes for a rapid, decisive victory in the West. The meticulously planned offensive, designed to knock France out of the war in 6 weeks, had faltered after just over a month. The reasons for this failure were multifaceted. The unexpectedly fierce Belgian resistance, which bought precious time, the surprisingly swift Russian mobilization, which forced the diversion of German troops to the Eastern Front earlier than anticipated, the professionalism and resilience of the British Expeditionary Force, the tenacious fighting spirit of the French army, which, despite heavy losses, refused to break. And crucially, the modifications made to the original Schlieffen Plan by Moltke, which weakened the critical right wing and led to tactical errors, such as Kluck's exposed flank. The retreat from the Marne marked the end of the war of movement on the Western Front. As the German armies dug in along the Aisne, the Allies, exhausted but emboldened by their success, attempted to outflank the German defensive positions. This initiated what became known as the Race to the Sea, a series of reciprocal outflanking maneuvers where each side attempted to advance around the northern end of the other's line. Both sides extended their lines northward towards the English Channel, each attempting to turn the other's flank before being outflanked themselves. This desperate struggle unfolded through battles such as Albert, Arras, and ultimately, the First Battle of Ypres. By late October and early November 1914, the race to the sea had concluded, not with a decisive breakthrough but with the opposing armies reaching the coast. There was no longer any open flank to turn. Faced with the inability to maneuver, both sides began to dig in, creating rudimentary trenches to provide protection from the devastating firepower of modern artillery and machine guns. These initial excavations, often shallow and hastily constructed, would soon evolve into vast, complex networks of interconnected trenches, dugouts, and barbed wire. The Western Front, stretching approximately 400 miles from the English Channel coast in Belgium down through northeastern France to the Swiss border, was now established. The dream of a short, decisive war had vanished, replaced by the grim reality of a static, attritional conflict. The failure of the rapid victory strategy meant that the war would not be fought by grand maneuvers and swift advances, but by agonizing, grinding battles of attrition fought from fixed positions in the mud and blood of the trenches. The stage was set for a type of warfare previously unimaginable, a brutal stalemate that would define the next 4 years and leave an indelible mark on the landscape of Europe and the collective memory of humanity. The establishment of the Western Front, with its nascent trench lines and the grinding promise of static warfare, presented a stark contrast to the Eastern Front. This vast theater of war, stretching over 1,000 miles from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south, dictated a different kind of conflict. Here, the sheer scale of the landscape and the immense distances between strategic points characterized a war of sweeping maneuvers, less dense troop concentrations, and at least initially greater fluidity. The battles would be larger, more mobile, and no less devastating in their human cost. Upon the outbreak of hostilities, Russia, often underestimated in its military capacity, began the colossal task of mobilizing its immense but geographically dispersed forces. The world anticipated the arrival of the Russian steamroller, a metaphor for its immense numerical superiority. Despite significant logistical challenges and an often inefficient railway network, the Russian High Command, honoring pre-war agreements with France, initiated a rapid, albeit somewhat premature, advance into German territory. This early offensive was designed to relieve pressure on the struggling French forces in the west, drawing German divisions eastward and preventing a swift collapse on the Western Front. Two primary Russian armies were tasked with the initial thrust into East Prussia, a strategically vital German province. To the north, a Russian army advanced from the east, moving towards the heart of the province. To its south, another Russian army pushed northward from Russian Poland, aiming to cut off the German defenders. The plan was ambitious, seeking to envelop the German Eighth Army, which was responsible for the defense of East Prussia. This German force, numerically inferior to the combined Russian armies, found itself facing a critical challenge almost immediately. Initial Russian advances met some success. The northern Russian army, moving with surprising speed, engaged German forces near Gumbinnen in mid-August. While the engagement was indecisive, the German command, rattled by the Russian attack and the perceived threat of being caught between two converging Russian armies, opted for a strategic withdrawal. This early German retreat, though minor in the grand scheme of the war, sent a ripple of concern through Berlin and prompted a critical reassessment of the situation on the Eastern Front. In response to these developments, the German High Command made a pivotal decision: to transfer significant forces from the Western Front to the east. These forces, desperately needed against the advancing French and British armies, were dispatched eastward. This reallocation, driven by the perceived urgency of the Russian threat, would later be seen as a contributing factor to the failure of the German offensive in the west. Simultaneously, a change in German leadership on the Eastern Front was enacted, bringing in experienced commanders to revitalize the defense. A seasoned Prussian field marshal, recalled from retirement, was placed in overall command, partnered with a brilliant chief of staff. This new leadership team quickly set about formulating a decisive counterplan. German commanders, utilizing critical intelligence from intercepted Russian radio communications, gained invaluable insight into their operational plans. They understood that the two main Russian armies, though converging, were operating with significant distances between them, creating a dangerous gap. The new German leadership decided to exploit this weakness, focusing their entire strength on the southern Russian army, which was advancing northward through difficult terrain and was particularly vulnerable. The stage was set for one of the most decisive battles of the early war on the Eastern Front, the Battle of Tannenberg. This engagement unfolded over several days in late August 1914 near the lakes and forests of southern East Prussia. The German strategy was audacious. They left a small screening force to contain the northern Russian army, betting its commander would be slow to react. The bulk of the German Eighth Army, through a series of rapid and complex railway movements, was secretly shifted south to confront the advancing southern Russian army. The southern Russian army, deep in German territory, was poorly supplied with stretched communication lines. Its commander, unaware of the full scale of the German redeployment and the impending trap, continued his northward push. The German forces, executing a near-perfect encirclement, attacked the flanks of the unsuspecting Russian army with overwhelming force. The battle was a tactical masterpiece for the Germans. They utilized their superior railway network to move troops rapidly, effectively outmaneuvering the slower-moving Russian forces. What followed was a catastrophic defeat for the Russian Empire. The southern Russian army was annihilated, tens of thousands of Russian soldiers were killed, and over 90,000 were taken prisoner. Vast quantities of artillery, machine guns, and other war material were captured. The commander of the southern Russian army, facing complete destruction and immense dishonor, tragically took his own life. The psychological impact of Tannenberg on Russia was profound, a brutal reminder of the challenges in confronting the highly organized German military machine. For Germany, it was a stunning victory, a morale booster that mitigated some of the disappointment from the Western Front stalemate. With the southern Russian army eliminated, the German command immediately turned its attention to the northern Russian army, which remained in East Prussia. In early September, immediately after Tannenberg, the Germans launched the first battle of the Masurian Lakes. This time, the objective was to drive the remaining Russian forces completely out of German territory. The northern Russian army, though shaken by the news from Tannenberg, was still a formidable fighting force. However, its position was now precarious, with its southern flank exposed and its morale undoubtedly affected. The German attack was swift and relentless. They advanced from the west and south, threatening to encircle the northern Russian army in a manner similar to Tannenberg. The Russian commander, recognizing the danger, ordered a fighting retreat. While costly, resulting in tens of thousands of casualties and prisoners, it prevented another complete annihilation. The Russian forces were pushed back across the frontier, effectively clearing East Prussia of Russian troops. The First Battle of the Masurian Lakes cemented German control over their eastern province, providing a crucial psychological and strategic victory. though it did not achieve the same level of crushing destruction as Tannenberg. While these dramatic events unfolded in East Prussia, another critical front was opening further south, along the extensive border between Russia and Austria-Hungary in Galicia. Here, Russian advances met less organized resistance. The Austro-Hungarian army, substantial but multi-ethnic, suffered from internal divisions and less effective leadership. The Russian High Command committed several armies to this Galician front, aiming to seize control of the strategically important province and threaten the Austro-Hungarian heartland. The initial phase of the Galician campaign, spanning late August and September 1914, saw significant Russian success. In the massive Battle of Galicia, Russian armies inflicted heavy defeats upon Austro-Hungarian forces, pushing them deep into the province. The battles saw enormous troop concentrations and incredibly high casualties, particularly for Austria-Hungary. Russian forces pushed deep into Galicia, capturing the provincial capital of Lemberg, now Lviv, and driving the Austro-Hungarian armies back hundreds of kilometers. The scale of the Austro-Hungarian defeat was staggering. They suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties, including a vast number of prisoners. This early setback severely weakened the Austro-Hungarian army, exposing its vulnerabilities and increasing its reliance on German military support. The Russian advance culminated in the siege of Przemysl, a heavily fortified Austro-Hungarian fortress. Its eventual fall, though not until the following year, symbolized early Russian dominance in this southern sector. These contrasting fortunes, catastrophic defeat in East Prussia, yet significant victories in Galicia, highlighted the immense scale and complexity of the Eastern Front. The Germans had effectively defended their own territory with brilliant tactical maneuvers, while the Russians had demonstrated their capacity for large-scale offensives against a weaker, if still formidable, opponent. As autumn turned to winter in 1914, the focus of the Eastern Front shifted once again, primarily to the vast plains of Russian Poland. German commanders, concerned by Russian pressure on their Austro-Hungarian ally, intervened more directly in this southern sector. German forces were once more redeployed, this time to bolster the struggling Austro-Hungarian lines and to launch offensives aimed at relieving the pressure. Battles in Poland, such as the Battle of Lodz in November, featured large-scale movements and attempts at encirclement on an even grander scale than East Prussia. Both sides sought to outmaneuver the other, resulting in a series of fluid, often chaotic, and incredibly costly engagements. The vastness of the terrain made continuous trench lines, as seen in the West, far more difficult, though temporary entrenchments were dug for cover. The fighting raged across frozen plains and through dense forests, with logistical challenges exacerbated by the harsh winter conditions. Despite the ferocity of these battles and the immense casualties suffered by all combatants, neither side achieved a decisive breakthrough. The Russian Empire, reeling from losses in East Prussia and facing strained resources, held its ground in Poland, preventing complete collapse. German and Austro-Hungarian efforts to decisively defeat Russia in 1914 ultimately fell short, but they had inflicted grievous wounds upon the Russian war machine. The initial phase of the Eastern Front in 1914 thus established a pattern that would largely define the war in the East for the coming years. It was a front of immense distances, where strategy often involved sweeping movements rather than the static attrition of the West. It was also a front where the German army demonstrated its superior organization, training, and tactical prowess, particularly in contrast to its Austro-Hungarian ally. For Russia, 1914 was a year of immense sacrifice and mixed fortunes. Despite early successes in Galicia, the devastating defeats at Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes exposed critical weaknesses in its military leadership, logistics, and communication systems. The dream of a swift Russian advance, the steamroller that would overwhelm the Central Powers, had been shattered. Instead, Russia found itself locked in a brutal attritional struggle against a highly capable enemy, placing an unbearable strain on its vast and fragile empire. The fluidity of initial campaigns would slowly give way to a more entrenched form of warfare, as the sheer scale of the conflict and the devastating power of modern weaponry forced armies to dig in, transforming the landscape into a battleground of mud, ice, and endless struggle.